Hi, everyone. Thank you all for coming out. Let me begin by expressing my gratitude to Lizzie and the wonderful students here at COLLIS. Shout out to John for writing some coffee. It's an honor to be here today. Coming from Syracuse to join you at Cornell reminds me of the second joyful mystery of the Rosary, when the Blessed Virgin Mary visited her cousin Elizabeth. I hope we all benefit from the fruit of that mystery and grow in love of neighbor today. Speaking of today, Catholics the world over are celebrating the feast of St. Luke, the gospel writer and personal physician of St. Paul. It's fitting that my talk about the health benefits of writing prayers would fall on this feast. As St. Pope John Paul II said, "In the designs of providence, there are no mere coincidences." Of course, the Holy Father said that after being shot, which echoes the assault that St. Paul received today at the hands of Alexander the coppersmith in today's Mass reading. So I pray that I make it through this talk unscathed, and please remember what I said earlier about love of neighbor. But the Mass readings for this feast day serve as a preamble for my talk. In them, Paul writes to his beloved Timothy to let him know that all his disciples abandoned him when the going got tough. Only Luke, who documents Paul's adventures in the Acts of the Apostles, remains with him in his hour of need. Paul tells Timothy to bring another gospel writer, Mark. And he writes, "When you come, bring the cloak that I left with Carpus and Troas, the papyrus rolls, and especially the parchments." We can only guess what was on those rolls and parchments, but we can safely presume that they provided Paul the same comforts as the cloak that would protect him from the elements. Further, we see on display here the primacy of the written word to Christian evangelization, spiritual protection, and health. Paul didn't tell Timothy to bring a club and some medicine. He told him to bring the word and something to write on. And if you will, indulge me here for another moment as I extend this exegesis. As a teacher of rhetoric and writing, I'm endlessly fascinated by the way that God communicates with us. He is, after all, the creator of all things and has at his disposal infinite and perfect ways of getting his meaning across to his children. We see this in the book of Genesis, God using language to inquire about us. He calls out like a loving father, inviting his children into conversation. Moments after our first parents fell, he asks Adam, "Where are you?" And then in the next chapter, he asks Cain, "Why are you angry? Why are you dejected?" And then he asks Cain again, "Where is your brother?" Followed by, "What have you done?" Other times, God communicates declaratively through nature. He admonished wickedness with the flood and then signed a covenant with the rainbow, two symbols that speak greater meanings than words can contain. Other times, he'll send his angels to deliver his message, as he did with Elijah and Tobias and the Blessed Virgin Mary. However, when God really wants us to know something, he writes it down. Need I say more than the Ten Commandments? What about Habakkuk, who complains to God when the Judeans are lawless and the Babylonians are marauding? Habakkuk pleads, "How long, O Lord, must I cry for help and you do not listen, or cry out to you violence and you do not intervene? Why do you let me see iniquity? Why do you simply gaze at evil?" The Lord answers this prayer with a vision and says to Habakkuk, "Write this down. Make it plain upon tablets so that the one who reads it may run." We see here God instructing us to use his gift of language to make his justice known and to protect us. Though my favorite act of God's writing opens John's gospel. "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And the Word became flesh, dwelling among us, and we saw his glory, the glory as of the Father's only Son, full of grace and truth." Need we any more proof that God is a writer and that he writes to us out of love? So, since God is a writer and we're all made in his image and likeness, I have a question for you. Have you ever considered writing to God? So, I'll let you ponder that for a second, and then we'll move on to what prayer is. So when we think of communicating with God,
Prayer immediately comes to mind. All religions have some form of this practice. Generally speaking, we are most familiar with oral prayer and mental prayer. The Catechism of the Catholic Church offers abundant guidance on this. In fact, a quarter of the entire catechism is dedicated to it. And we have additional insights provided through the holy men and women of the church. The closest thing to an official and concise definition of prayer is a personal relationship with the living God. Prayer is intended to be a way of life. As St. Paul tells us, we are to pray without ceasing. The Catechism section on prayer opens with two more extended definitions that simultaneously represent the variety of ways we can pray as well as the unity in our prayer. The first comes from a young 19th century Carmelite nun named Saint Therese of Lisieux. She writes, "For me, prayer is a surge of the heart. It is a simple look turned toward heaven. It is a cry of recognition and love, embracing both trial and joy." The next definition comes from the writings of Saint John Damascene, an Eastern Orthodox monk and poet who lived under Muslim rule in Jerusalem in the 7th and 8th centuries. He writes, "Prayer is the raising of one's mind and heart to God, or the requesting of good things from God." These are instructive, albeit different definitions of prayer, one inviting us to be simple and childlike and loving, and the other inviting contemplation and petition. What they have in common is their reference to the heart. Why the heart and not the spirit or the soul? That is a matter of simple math. Scripture names all three as sources of prayer, but the heart is mentioned more than 1,000 times. And as we'll see when we soon learn from scientific studies using corpus linguistics and experimental psychology, the frequency with which a word appears matters when it comes to prayer. In fact, the Catechism plainly states that the where of prayer matters more than the how of prayer. I quote, "Where does prayer come from? Whether prayer is expressed in words or gestures, it is the whole of man who prays. According to Scripture, it is the heart that prays. If our heart is far from God, the words of prayer are in vain." The church emphasizes the qualities of our heart over whether we can say the Ave Maria in Latin, which is a good and beautiful practice. It does this because God speaks to us in our hearts first, inviting us to prayer. Remember him calling to Adam, "Where are you?" The Catechism explains it this way. In prayer, the faithful God's initiative of love always comes first. Our own first step is always a response. As God gradually reveals himself and reveals man to himself, prayer appeals as a reciprocal call, a covenant drama. Through words and actions, this drama engages the heart. It unfolds throughout the whole history of salvation, end quote. So whether God is calling a teenage girl in France or an ethnically Arab Orthodox monk in Jerusalem, he calls them both to prayer from their hearts. A final word on this section before we move on. In these definitions, you may have noticed a few key words that expand the realm of prayer into the territory of writing. The Catechism has told us that prayer can be expressed in gestures and also in action. Writing is most certainly an action. It's an act of creation. In writing, we make marks so that our meanings and messages can be carried far and wide, though not everyone throughout history has endorsed this quality of writing. Pardon me. The distance that can be created between a text and its author posed the problem to Plato, who much preferred face-to-face communication. In the Phaedrus, Socrates says to his interlocutor, writing, Phaedrus, has this strange quality. It is very like painting, for the creatures of painting stand like live beings. But if one asks them a question, they preserve a solemn silence. And so it is with written words. You might think they spoke as if they had intelligence, but if you question them, wishing to know about their sayings, they always say only one and the same thing. And every word, when once it is written, is bandied about, alike those who understand and those who have no interest in it. And it knows not whom to speak or not to speak. When ill-treated or unjustly reviled, it always needs its Father to help it, for it has no power to protect or help itself. Although Socrates was definitely no fan of rhetoricians like myself, he does have a point here. Merely making words and calling them prayers isn't going to get us closer to a personal relationship with the true and loving God. The church's guidance on prayer disposes of Socrates' critique. It is the act of writing that stirs the heart and answers God, not the text we produce. So now that we've come to a Christian definition of prayer, we're ready to tackle the scientific definition before we review a few studies. It's a simpler definition by comparison. Yeah.
It's a little hard to hear you.
It is.
A little slower and louder.
Slower and louder. Absolutely.
You're saying a lot more things.
I am. So I am coming up on the scientific definition of prayer. It is. I can speak up. Is this? Oh, this is going right to the internet. Cool. As I pause, I will drink some of this delicious coffee. So to recap, we have prayer, religious, happening in the heart. It's a movement of the heart. Science has a much more concise definition. Prayer is self-disclosure to God. That's it. This is a definition that's accurate in terms of the Bible, however. Recall God asking Adam to disclose himself. Right, where are you? And this definition puts the practice of writing prayers squarely in the psychological literature of expressive writing as well. So let's talk about that. Now I'd like to address the second half of the title of my presentation, the emerging science of writing prayers for wellness. I'm going to tell you about what I think is the most significant medical breakthrough in the 20th century. It took place at Southern Methodist University in 1986 when two psychologists, James Pennebaker and Sandra Beale, gave 46 students in an intro to psychology course a writing assignment. Nothing special about that yet. Pennebaker and Beale, though, were familiar with psychological studies that found people who confided in others had lower instances of stress-related diseases. The relationship between disclosure of traumatic events and long-term health was grounded in studies that had been occurring since the 1960s among Holocaust survivors. Simply, those who talked about their horrific experiences in the concentration camps were found to have stronger social networks, more pro-social behaviors, and better long-term health. However, those studies were based on talking and talk therapy. A prime example of this research can be found in Viktor Frankl's amazing autobiography, Man's Search for Meaning. Based on his own experiences in the concentration camp, Frankl created logotherapy, a type of psychotherapy focused on finding words to make sense of catastrophic life experiences. Pennebaker and Beale, though, wanted to push the definition of what confiding could be. Right? After all, not everyone has a confidant or is comfortable narrating painful or shameful events to a therapist. In the 1980s, we weren't yet in the throes of the epidemic of loneliness that we're experiencing today, but post-Vietnam America was well on its way to the solitary shift in our culture that Robert Putnam documented in his year 2000 book, Bowling Alone. Against this cultural backdrop, Pennebaker and Beale asked the question that would have agitated Socrates. What if students confided in a piece of paper? Well, to find out, the researchers divided their class into 4 groups and asked them to write for 15 minutes a day for 4 days. Each group, the first group was the control group. They were told to write a 15-minute essay each night for 4 days on the shoes they wore or about a tree they could see from their living room. The other 3 groups were asked to write, paradoxically, about the most traumatic thing that's ever happened to them. And preferably about something that they had never told anybody else. So one of the trauma groups was instructed to write only about their feelings about this traumatic event. Another group was told to write only about the facts. And the third group was told to write about both the what of what happened and the how the student felt about it. So the experimenters then followed up with the students 6 months later to test their hypothesis about the long-term positive health benefits of disclosing traumatic events in writing. They found out that the students who wrote about their traumas had fewer visits to the campus health center for any reason, psychological, physical, flu season, any of that. So there was reason to believe early on that disclosing traumatic experiences and emotions in writing was good for our physical and mental health. In the 4 decades since that study, more than 800 other studies on expressive writing have been conducted with participants facing health problems ranging from physical conditions like cancer and irritable bowel syndrome to psychological problems like depression and anxiety, as well as those who've survived horrific life experiences like terrorism and abuse. Most of these studies actually follow the same protocol that Pennebaker and Beale created back in 1986, and they still do today. Write for 15 minutes per day for 4 consecutive days about the thing that's troubling you the most. Statistically, the study suggests that those who follow this protocol will experience a small but significant benefit to their physical and mental health. A recent meta-analysis in the British Journal of Clinical Psychology by linguist Lynn Guo at Syracuse University found that expressive writing provides a long-lasting positive effect on depression, anxiety, and stress when done in shorter intervals between writing sessions. So the original Pennebaker protocol of 15 minutes a day for 4 days seems to be the most effective one that we have, and it's one that has become the gold standard even in written prayers, which we'll get to shortly. So despite the obvious similarities, however, between expressive writing and confession in the Catholic faith and prayer in general, as well as a mountain of research about the relationship between religion and health, the first study on writing prayers wasn't published until 2002, so relatively recently. The delay in examining prayer as a form of writing seems providential because from all the studies conducted on expressive writing, researchers were able to identify the 4 characteristics of expressive discourse that are associated with personal psychological benefits. These are the number of causal words people use when they write. Causal words are like because, infer, or thus, and they signal that the writer is making meaningful connections. The next dimension is expressions of insight, indicated by words such as realize and understand. The third dimension is the number of negative words, including those like angry, sad, wrong, and whatever they're chanting inside. Or they could be happy chants, I don't know. I'm disinclined to believe that they're happy though. All right, decorum. All right, and lastly, as you'd imagine, positive words. The more positive words that one writes can also be measured. So equipped with this information, experimenters could compare texts between people. They could compare genres of writing. So this was put to test. This was put to the test in the article, Praying About Difficult Experiences as Self-Disclosure to God. So in this first study of written prayers, researchers asked 66 seminarians to either write a trauma narrative, like the one I described before, or letters to God asking for help about a trauma, or a spontaneous prayer to God asking for help about a trauma. The findings were promising. The letters and prayers to God surpassed the disclosure narratives in causal words, expressions of insight, and positive words. So writing a prayer resulted in more positive words. Correspondingly, they included fewer negative words than the trauma discourse. The researchers concluded, quote, prayers for personal help with difficult life experiences contain similar linguistic characteristics to disclosures as defined by the psychological literature. The disclosure characteristics are linked to various benefits that can be realized by when persons pour out their thoughts and feelings about troubling events in prayers to God. A decade later, this study was replicated as well. Prayers, as we all know, have their own vocabulary and conventions that are moderated by tradition. Take, for example, the missal that traveled with my father during his 30 years of military service. It offers the penitent guidelines for concluding prayers, depending on which person of the Holy Trinity is last mentioned in the prayer. I'm not inclined to believe that adhering to the conventions while spontaneously writing a prayer will translate into psychological benefit, aside from the satisfaction of adhering to liturgical rigor. However, Bishop Robert Barron, in his small book, An Introduction to Prayer, would be quick to remind us that Christian prayer does have rules, and this rule was observed in the prayer we heard right before we ate. We must pray in Jesus' name. He cites John 14, 13 through 14 verses, where Jesus says, I'll do whatever you ask in my name, so that my Father may be glorified in the Son. If in my name you ask me for anything, I will do it, end quote. We do this, the bishop tells us, so that Christ can advocate for us. But moreover, quote, when we pray through Christ our Lord, we are assuming the stance and attitude of Jesus, aligning ourselves to him, compelling others to desire what he desires for peace, for justice, forgiveness, and sometimes just for a little peace and quiet. So correspondingly, studies have found that the more religious words that are used in a prayer, the greater the positive psychological effect, right? We see this in a 2007 study conducted by an interdisciplinary group in the Midwest. They examined the prayers of 231 underserved women with breast cancer in an online support group. Of these 231, 97 were very active prayer writers, and they wrote an average of like 11,000 words of prayers. The researchers found that the women whose prayers included a higher percentage of religion words, Alleluia, blessed, God, Jesus, etc., had lower negative emotions about their cancer and higher levels of perceived self-efficacy and functional well-being. A 2020 study that was conducted on 117 patients with renal cell carcinoma, the type of cancer, offers a similar insight. This study, however, only asked participants to write about their deepest thoughts and emotions about their cancer. No mention of God or religion appeared anywhere in the writing prompt. Each participant wrote 4 times over the course of 10 days. 89% of the participants chose to write about religion at least once, and those who did write about religion positively experienced a greater sense of peace and lower cancer-related symptoms over the following 10 months. So those who wrote about religion negatively experienced greater sleep disturbances within those same 10 months. So there are too few studies, however, to be conclusive, but those that have been published suggest that employing a positive religious vocabulary translates into tangible health benefits. These studies make me wonder what the health benefits would be of writing a prayer like the Litany of the Saints. That's a spoiler alert for all of you attending the writing workshop afterwards. All kidding aside, writing positive religious words does seem to fall in line with another study conducted this year in the journal Social Science and Medicine that found that adults in the United Kingdom who were more resolute in their faith experience better mental health generally. So being resolute in our faith is exactly what we need in times of crisis, of course. In fact, one of the unique forms of suffering that occurs among religious people who are victims of natural disasters is that their belief in God is tested, which causes significant psychological distress. Of course, this distress exacerbates the already tragic conditions like those that our neighbors to the south are living in as they rebuild after the hurricanes. 2 recent studies examined how expressive writing can contribute to spiritual fortitude in the wake of natural disasters. One paper titled Spiritually Oriented Expressive Writing and Promoting Positive Outcomes After Natural Disaster reports on a longitudinal study of 132 Christian survivors of the floods that devastated Louisiana in 2016. Approximately 1 month after the floods, the participants were asked to reflect on their thoughts and feelings about their disaster experience while focusing on their relationships with God. They also completed surveys for a quantitative analysis. So these participants wrote for 10 minutes, took a 10-minute break, and then wrote for another 10 minutes about God and their surviving of the flood. So when compared to study participants who wrote about a control topic, those who wrote about their relationship with God had more meaning in their lives, and they know that through the surveys that were given. Those participants who had lower pre-intervention attitudes toward God demonstrated the strongest growth and meaning over the next 6 months. So the people who had the weakest faith conducted the writing, and actually their faith was strengthened through this process. Coincidentally, writing didn't delude participants into being satisfied with their lives or their circumstances. Rather, it strengthened their relationships with God and gave them more resolve to march on after the disaster. In fact, they all reported pretty low satisfaction with their circumstances at that time. Another relationship that can be strained during natural disasters is the one between a pregnant mother and the child that she's carrying. Researchers in Canada examined how spiritually oriented expressive writing, type of prayer, could benefit pregnant women who survived the 2016 Canadian wildfires in Alberta. 2016 was a bad year, wasn't it? As it turns out, pregnant women who survive wildfires experience post-traumatic stress disorder at a rate 2 to 3 times higher than pregnant women who survive other types of natural disaster. This stress leads to pregnancy complications and strained relationships. The researchers administered expressive writing prompts online for 15 minutes a day for 4 days to a group of pregnant women, and then they asked them to reflect on their writing experiences. Several themes emerged in their reflections. The women reported being more socially connected and eager to engage in spiritual practices. They also showed signs of post-traumatic growth. Unfortunately, the study didn't directly report on the connections between mother and child. However, the psychological, social, and spiritual growth they experienced suggests that what we hope would be a stable and loving relationship. Another study in Korea documents the benefits of keeping a spiritual diary. It's not unlike the other studies of the folks in natural disasters. It examined the spiritual growth of 385 adults who kept regular spiritual diaries and found that those who wrote entries 5 to 7 times per week had greater satisfaction and mental health and spiritual connectedness than those who only wrote 1 to 4 times a week. So what this study and the two about natural disasters suggest is that it's good to have a prayer practice in place before a life-changing event. Using the discipline of writing can help you reinforce that practice and track your own spiritual growth as well. So before we transition to the implications of these studies for our daily lives, I'd like to end with a gentle word of caution. So an article examining the prayer coping strategies of veterans who recently returned from the war found that soldiers who disclosed themselves to God in prayer practices experienced greater calm and focus than those who did not. However, those soldiers who prayed what the researchers called deferring or avoiding prayers had greater instances of depression and anxiety than those who disclosed themselves and their emotions in prayer to God. So what is a deferring / avoiding prayer? It's asking God or telling God to swoop in and wave a magic wand and make whatever's troubling with you disappear. If that's your prayer practice and writing, then it seems like you're not going to fare very well according to this study. So of all the studies that I've reviewed in preparing this talk, this is the only one with the type of prayer that seems to be counterproductive in terms of mental health. Great. So now, let's move on to the good stuff, the implications and suggestions for how we can take this literature and bring it to life in our own lives. So now that I've conveyed some literature on the ways that writing can improve our health, both physically and mentally, I'd like to offer you 5 ideas for integrating written prayers into your life. For some of this may seem like additional homework, but from what I understand about heaven, I think it's writing to grow spiritually seems well worth the effort. So the first thing I like to talk about is distractions. So let's begin with the classic problem of prayer, distraction. In the Ways of Mental Prayer, Reverend Dom Vitalis Lahodi writes, quote, "Every distraction well combated, far from injuring us, increases our merits and hastens our progress. How many acts of humility, patience, and resignation they make us practice. Every effort we make to return to God is a preference we give him over the objects which draw away our thoughts. a victory gained over the demon, and a new merit for heaven. So the classic expressive writing protocol can help you win that victory. Scientific prayer writing protocols differ from prayer journals in significant ways, especially the ones you'll find in the bookstore. The protocols themselves are more constrained and regimented. And if you lean into that regiment, you'll do well on your journey to combat distraction. So start writing for 5 minutes a day for a few consecutive days, just 5 minutes. And you'll find that you can focus for that short period of time. In fact, you'll likely find that the writing concentrates you because you can only write or even type one letter at a time. This is much different than our imaginations, right? Which can cycle through sights and sounds and distant memories at hypersonic speed. Writing is slow, writing is inefficient compared to speech and cognition. So set a timer and embrace the slowness. Start with a personal prayer. If you don't know what to write, you can always start with, God, I don't know what to write. And he'll fill in the rest, I promise you. Good. 2, intimacy with God. So using prayer to grow in intimacy with God. Saint Therese, a profound writer who always chose the little way of children, had this to say about prayer. How great is the power of prayer? One can call it a queen who has at each instant free access to the king and who is able to obtain whatever she asks. To be heard is not necessarily to read from a book some beautiful formula composed for the occasion. If this were the case, alas, I would have to be pitied. Outside the divine office, which I am very unworthy to recite, I do not have the courage to force myself to search out beautiful prayers in books. There are so many of them, it really gives me a headache, and each prayer is more beautiful than the others. I cannot recite them all, and not knowing which to choose, I do like children do. I do like children who do not know how to read. I very simply say to God what I wish to say without composing beautiful sentences, and he always understands me. There's tremendous irony in that because her definition of prayer is the one that the Catholic Catechism gives us first in the book. But we can use prayer to get to know God in a new way. Writing is a different way of expressing what's in your heart. Use that difference to learn a little bit more about yourself and your Heavenly Father. Recall at the outset of this talk, the Catechism said is God gradually reveals himself and reveals man to himself. Prayer appears as a reciprocal call. So in prayer, we can grow closer to God and ourselves with writing and go back to that examination. And go back and reread what we've written and examine our growth. 3, any devotion can become a writing task. Many Catholics have devotions like the Rosary or the Brown Scapular. These can become automatic in our lives. We can interject new meaning into them by reflecting on what they mean. We could follow the expressive writing protocol and write for 15 minutes on the mysteries of the Rosary before or after we say it. Or we can reflect on why we wear a scapular or any other religious devotion that anyone has in any faith, as a matter of fact. I find writing to be a wonderful addition also to Lectio Divina. After spending time with the daily readings, write about some aspect that calls out to you. You don't need to compose a homily, rather think of it as meditating on paper. 4, any writing task can be sanctified. The more I think about writing and spirituality, the more ways I see it being a profound tool to help us follow Christ's teaching, especially the hard ones that I personally am not inclined to do. Moment of confession. So let's take Matthew 25, for example. Jesus said, "For I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty and you gave me drink. A stranger and you welcomed me. Naked and you clothed me. Ill and you cared for me. In prison and you visited me." Well, providing material goods to others is relatively easy with food pantries and clothing drop-offs, but visiting the sick, going to jail to visit someone, Here's where writing can actually help us follow Christ's teaching. Why not write a get well card if you're immunocompromised yourself? Brighten someone's day out of love for Jesus, right? And recently I've discovered that the Order of Malta, a Catholic organization, has a prison pen pal program as well. So writing to someone incarcerated can make a profound difference in their life and in yours. It also provides a way of reflecting on the acts of the apostles when the disciples were in prison for doing the will of God. And number 5, let other types of writing be your prayer. I like to conclude by holding out an olive branch to those of you in the audience who are not inclined to write your prayers in a journal. I get it, expressive writing isn't for everyone. However, you can and probably should write your prayers. Recall that any act or gesture that comes from the heart and responds to God's call can be an act of prayer. As the saints intercede in our lives, we can use writing to intercede in the world. We have the example of the saint of Nagasaki, Dr. Takashi Nagai. While he hasn't yet been canonized, his words have profoundly shaped the world after he survived the atomic bombing of Nagasaki in 1945. As he was slowly dying from radiation poisoning, he produced an unfathomable corpus of writing. In it, he recounts the story of surviving the bombing and forming a roving medical corps to minister to the survivors in Nagasaki. Dr. Nagai made it his mission to write to bring Christ's peace to the world. The Bells of Nagasaki, which is among his better known works, concludes in this way, quote, "Men and women of the world, never again plan war. With this atomic bomb, war can only mean suicide for the human race. From this atomic waste, the people of Nagasaki confront the world and cry out, no more war. Let us follow the commandment of love and work together. The people of Nagasaki prostrate themselves before God and pray. Grant that Nagasaki may be the last atomic wilderness in the history of the world." What a powerful prayer that God has been so good to answer. And I'm looking forward to answering questions and to the workshop that follows this talk, but permit me to conclude with the words of St. Paul from his first letter to the Thessalonians. He writes, "Cheer the faint-hearted, support the weak, be patient with all, seek what is good both for each other and for all. Rejoice always, pray without ceasing, in all circumstances give thanks, for this is the will of God for you in Christ Jesus. Do not quench the spirit, do not despise prophetic utterances, test everything, retain what is good." I urge you to test prayer writing and see if it's good for you. Thank you.
We do have some type of questions.
Oh, good.
And those who are attending on Zoom, feel free to enter your question into the chat. And we'll have someone read aloud your questions for you. So everyone, when I get started. I'm actually happy to do so.
Oh, okay.
So you gave us the scientific definition of prayer, which I think was self-disclosure to God, self-disclosure of oneself to God.
Yes.
And I'm curious, just because I have no cognizance of this kind of this area, how are these definitions formulated? I inferred that these were psychological definitions, so how did these psychologists come up with these?
That's a good question, because it does seem rather arbitrary that self-disclosure would account for prayer. However, what they were trying to do when they came up with that definition was to kind of give a blanket statement about the genre of prayer. So what makes a prayer usually is that it's addressed to God or some other deity, right? And because expressive discourse, they have this writing aspect. That's where all of the writing research on psychology is. They kind of align the two. So the mechanism of action of expressive writing that makes it salubrious is opening up and telling people what's going on in your life, right? So if you do that on paper, you're disclosing whatever's floating around in there that's potentially harming you. And by doing that address to God, that is the definition of prayer. It is not necessarily the most eloquent definition, even though it is short, but it can account for a lot of different types of prayer. As a matter of fact, I mean, I've come up with, I think, 16 I'm going to have up on the website. But yes, so is that a good enough answer on that?
Yeah, so in other words, it comes from, when from the definitions say by like the philosophical method, like going to like the traditions, how do they
Yeah.
spread it, and then translate that. It sounds like the definition comes from the practices themselves, of people who are saying that they are. That
Yes. Yes. So we're kind of taking for granted that the people are in fact invoking God in their hearts when they are writing God on the paper. Unfortunately, I mean, one could falsify that, but then, you know, self-report studies are notoriously difficult to corroborate. Hey.
Yeah, so if you build this habit of expressive writing, it seems like you would produce a lot of writing. Is there any practice that is recommended for like, you know, what you wrote in the past, or organizing it, or trying to draw some meaning out of it, or is it actually like it's the act of writing and not?
So from a disclosure standpoint, it's the act of writing, just kind of letting the water out of the bathtub, so to speak, that has a cathartic effect that translates into a health benefit. However, there's numerous examples of people of all faiths doing this. I mean, the one that comes to mind is Thomas Merton, who actually turned all of his reflections into books. One became more autobiographical, others became meditations. And that's a pretty routine practice where people publish their meditations on either different texts or on different seasons of the year, things like that. So one thing you could do if you do develop a robust practice is you could either edit it into some kind of more complex text, or you could publish them individually, almost like a chapbook of poetry, as some folks have. Thank you. Hey.
Do you have, this takes the bibliography, this, kind of break down to the ones that I'm interested in?
I do have a bibliography, and I use it to drive traffic to my website. So I'm happy to give it to you. It's at resiliencewritingproject.org. I can give that to you. So it'll be up there in a post after today's talk, as a matter of fact. There aren't many though. So I reference, just to follow up with that, I reference there being in excess of 800 studies of expressive writing on PubMed as of a couple days ago. Writing prayers is a sliver of that, unfortunately. I mean, I was actually shocked when I taught a course at SU about expressive writing to see how little was published on spirituality and writing from the psychological standpoint. There are many, many studies of prayer in health and psychology, but none on the practice of actually creating prayers. Hi.
The key to all this is a relationship with God, and I do know that trauma, relationships with other people and with God. So are you saying that this writing practice can help with that? And what else can you say about that relationship?
Oh, certainly. I mean, so from a very cursory standpoint, anytime you write to somebody, you're going to feel more intimately connected with them. Even if you're writing, why did you do this to me? You're still taking the time to write to them, right? But the studies that I mentioned about the survivors of the natural disaster, in particular the folks from Louisiana, the folks who had their faith most challenged were the ones who benefited most from doing the writing, as a matter of fact. And the same thing with the women who were in the wildfire in Canada. And that was a more diverse study. In Louisiana, the folks were all Christians. I believe they were all women as well. In Canada, doing the writing and reflecting upon it actually just made them want to do some type of religious practice. So some went and were more devout to their yoga practice or other faiths as well. So the writing, it conditions us. It becomes a habit. It becomes a discipline. And that's why starting small with something like 5 minutes a day can just get you into the habit of that. And it's amazing what you can pile up and achieve in 5 minutes if you do it on a regular basis. And then in terms of studies of post-traumatic stress disorder in writing, there are many. And I'll give you this factoid. I can put this in the bibliography too if you're interested. The Department of Veteran Affairs in the last 2 years has come out and said that it is endorsing WET, written exposure therapy, which they abbreviate as WET, which is their kind of fun governmental term for expressive writing. It's all it is expressive writing. The protocols are virtually identical. And they did inferiority studies comparing that type of therapy to cognitive-based therapy, which is the gold standard for talk therapy in the US, and then also to prolonged exposure therapy, which is another modality. And the findings of those two studies show that the writing itself is as effective for this reason. People who have trauma, especially veterans who have to go to a big hospital that's aggravating and bureaucratic, tend not to complete their therapy. But they will write for 15 minutes over 4 days and do that. And they'll keep doing that. So adherence to expressive writing is much higher to adherence to medication and also to actually going to therapy. So in that way, it's not better than, but it's better than nothing. And in that case, it's very helpful. And there's still studies that are ongoing about this because the cohorts for these studies are so small that in order to get like a clinically significant benefit that would please the FDA, you would need to do studies for years and years and years. So it's promising. Write about what bothers you. Sure. That's why I like this slide. I don't know if you can see it. So this is outside the reading room in the New York Public Library. If you go up to the 3rd floor, there's it's called the History of Writing or something like that. So you have Moses with the 10 Commandments, you have this fellow scribing, and then you have Gutenberg the printing press, and then you have Otto Mayr-Hopper doing the what is that called? The linotype. And what I love about this image is that it shows how just the act of copying the word can be a meditation that centers you when the world around you is quite literally burning down, right? So, and this itself is a visual metaphor to some extent about what prayer is, right? Because you already have God there first, and you're just responding by enacting it. So meditation can be done in writing. I find that, I don't know if you've ever had the experience of sitting down to write and then losing time, right? You like look up and you're like, hold on, I've been doing this for how long? That can happen. So you can get into a flow state while writing. And if you do it with something religious, absolutely. But is it the same as doing meditation? It's more embodied and active. Hey.
Hi, thank you so much for this talk.
Well, thank you.
I'm going to ask a question that you don't have to answer. But
I can't dodge it now.
I was wondering if you could talk more about your personal experience with this writing.
So Sure, I'm actually happy to tell that story, and I'll start about 12 years ago with that. So when I was a grad student in New Jersey at Montclair State, I worked at the Writing Center, and I was on fellowship, so I got paid through the summer, and they needed to give us something to do in the summer. So we had a community partnership, and the partnership was with the Jewish Community Center of Metro New York, in particular their Drurian Fellowship, which was a women's group, and all the constituents of that group were over the age of 70 and widows. And many of them have known each other for decades. I think the youngest at the time was like 74, and my matriarch was 96. They were amazing people. And we had a book club and a writing workshop with them. And they were all into reading the book. They loved the book, writing. They were very resistant to write. But then little by little, over this 8-week program, they started writing. And then one day they all kind of like came bopping into, the temple where we were meeting. And I was like, what's going on? Like, does everybody have spring fever? And they said, oh, it's the writing. I'm like, what do you mean it's the writing? Like, I'm an English grad student. I've never felt this way writing, It felt quite the opposite, and sometimes still do. And they said that it was in both the remembering of the stories, because some of them, we were doing a lot of like life history writing, and then also in the sharing of the stories, they felt more connected. So there were ladies in the group who had known each other for 40 years, who realized that they had known virtually nothing about each other. And it was that it was through the writing that they got to know each other. So that kind of keyed me in, and that's where I kind of sought out like what the relationship between writing and health was. And there's a good literature on that, especially in terms of aging. And that's how I happened upon expressive writing as well in this way. This was not a part of my training. And then what was fascinating was I do work with the Onondaga Community Trauma Task Force. So this is an ad hoc group of social workers predominantly who go out and volunteer their services in the community to bridge gaps and things like that. Well, we created what's called a post-trauma response team. So now anywhere in Onondaga County where we are, you can call 211 or 911, and you can have trauma responders actually go out. This is fantastic service, completely free, done by volunteers who are professionally trained at either hospitals or other organizations in town. And this service went live during COVID as New York was opening back up. So around like April 21, we opened up. And then by June, we were seeing a lot of business, right? Which isn't really good when you're a trauma responder, but c'est la vie. Syracuse is a small city with very big city crime. And there were several incidents that month, June of 21, that made the news that were just really heart-wrenching. And I remember going to the debriefing meeting. We were still on Zoom, so everybody was on the screen. And folks were debriefing. And I remember asking them, the social work team, saying, how do you do this? You work at a hospital all day. You're a social worker at an urban hospital. You deal with people who are having the worst days of their lives every day, multiple times a day. And now you volunteer to go out into the community to meet with people who are having the worst days of their lives every day. And the answer is like burned into my brain. They said, well, sometimes we give each other hugs in the hallway, and sometimes they cry together, or we cry together. And I said, and they said, no, that's it, man. We just kind of move on. And I was like, with all of the ire of a humanities professor who knows nothing about being a social worker, I was like, that's unacceptable. The funny part about that is my response was, I can teach you a writing workshop, which is it seems like a caricature of humanities folks. But when I said that, I was thinking about this. Like, there are writing protocols out there that can actually help you process trauma. And from that moment, I wound up doing 14 workshops at Upstate Hospital after that every month. And it started with social work, and then it moved to social work and nursing, and social work and nursing and transitional care. And next thing you know, I have like neurosurgeons on the call. So every month we have this writing workshop, and it kept growing and growing. And it's been this organic process. As a matter of fact, tomorrow, I'm going to be giving a workshop to all of the disaster mental health workers in the Red Cross in the state of New York. So this is not something that I make money on. This is something that I'm trying to give back out of the Catholic principle of subsidiarity. I'm a community member. I have a solution. Here you go. It's very free and lightweight. You just need a pen and paper and a little bit of time. So that's my experience with doing this. Getting to the spirituality is relatively new. I had to go seeking this out because the literature doesn't scream prayer in any way whatsoever. But I did, during COVID, create a class on expressive writing and the relationships between writing and health that then we've regularized, and it's taught every year now at SU at the 100 level. So thanks for asking. Yeah.
So on that note,
Yeah.
A little bit of time. We're going to transition to the workshop soon. So first, I want to thank Dr. Grant so much for this talk.
Thank you.
For joining in.